Sometimes the smallest hearts carry the biggest courage. When 8-year-old Willa found a dying donkey abandoned in the forest, everyone told her to walk away. The traders had left the sick animal behind, burning with fever in the pine woods. While the adults said it was nature's way, Willa saw pain in those eyes that reminded her of losing her own father. She chose to help when everyone else chose to look away. Using her mother's simple remedies and her own gentle hands, she nursed the donkey back to health. Years later, that moment of kindness would teach her grandson the most important lesson of all. What happens when we choose love over fear, even when it seems hopeless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine branches like memories, refusing to let go. 65-year-old Willa Crow-Wing adjusted her worn leather jacket and watched her grandson Ben kick at the fallen needles beneath his feet. At 10 years old, he carried himself with the restless energy of a city child, all fidgeting hands and darting eyes, uncomfortable in the vast silence of the Montana wilderness. "Grandma, how much farther?" Ben asked, his voice cutting through the cathedral quiet of the forest. "My phone hasn't had signal for like an hour." Willa smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening like tributaries carved by decades of laughter and sorrow. "Patience, little wolf. The best stories can't be rushed, and neither can the places that hold them." They walked along what had once been a well-worn trading path, now barely visible beneath years of fallen leaves and encroaching undergrowth. Willa's weathered hands traced the bark of an ancient pine, and she could almost hear the echoes of pack trains and wagon wheels that had once traveled this route. The forest held its memories close, just as she did. In her jacket pocket, her fingers found the small wooden donkey her father had carved for her so many years ago. The toy was smooth from decades of handling, its edges worn soft by countless moments of nervous energy and quiet reflection. She had carried it through every important moment of her life, through her mother's teachings, through her own journey as a healer, through the births of her children and grandchildren. Today, it felt heavier than usual, weighted with the story she was about to share. "This place looks like every other part of the forest," Ben observed, adjusting his backpack straps. His sneakers, designed for city sidewalks, slipped occasionally. "On the uneven ground, I don't see why we had to come all the way out here just to talk." Willa paused at a clearing where sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts. "Some stories belong to the places where they happened. They're not just tales to be told. They're living things that grow from the soil and the memories. Buried here," the clearing opened before them, perhaps 50 yards across, ringed by towering pines that had stood sentinel for over a century. Wildflowers dotted the grass, Indian paintbrush, lupine and beargrass swaying in the gentle breeze. A small creek wound along the eastern edge, its water singing softly over smooth stones. Ben looked around with barely concealed impatience. To him, it was just another patch of wilderness, indistinguishable from the thousands of acres they had already traversed. But to Willa, every stone held significance. Every tree was a witness to events that had shaped not just her life, but the lives of generations. "Sit with me," she said, settling onto a fallen log that time had polished smooth. "Let me tell you about your great-great-grandmother, Luna Crow-Wing, and the summer that changed everything." Ben sat reluctantly, pulling out his phone to check for signal bars that he knew wouldn't be there. "Mum said you were going to tell me some old family story. But honestly, Grandma, I've heard a million of these already. They're all the same. Somebody did something brave a long time ago, and I'm supposed to feel proud of being Native American or whatever." Willa's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. She had heard this dismissal before, from other grandchildren who had grown up in cities, disconnected from the rhythms of the natural world that had sustained their ancestors. She understood their skepticism, even as it saddened her. "This isn't a story about being proud of your heritage, Ben," she said quietly. This is a story about choosing kindness when the world tells you to be cruel. It's about a little girl who saved a dying animal and accidentally changed the course of history. She pointed to a spot near the creek where the grass grew in a slightly different pattern, greener and more lush than the surrounding area. Right there in 1887, your great-great-grandmother Luna built a small shelter where she practiced her healing arts. She was known throughout the territory as a medicine woman who could cure ailments that baffled white doctors. Ben followed her gaze, but saw only grass and wildflowers. How do you know exactly where it was? That was like over 100 years ago. Because Luna brought me here when I was your age, Willa replied. She was my grandmother, and she made sure I knew every story, every lesson, every plant that grew in this forest, just as I'm making sure you know them now. The breeze picked up, rustling the pine needles above them with a sound like distant conversation. Willa closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her. She could almost see Luna as she had been then. A woman in her 60s, moving through the forest with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the healing properties of every root and leaf. Luna had one daughter, Willa continued, opening her eyes to meet Ben's gaze. A girl named Dawn Crow Wing, who was 8 years old in the summer of 1887. Dawn was my mother, and this story begins with her. Ben shifted on the log, his attention finally caught despite himself. Your mum, but I thought this was about some donkey. It is, Willa said. But every story is really about the people who choose to care when caring seems impossible. Your great-grandmother Dawn was one of those people. She was small for her age, quiet in the way that children become when they've seen too much sorrow, too early. Her father, my grandfather, had died in a hunting accident 2 years before, and she was still carrying that grief like a stone in her chest. Willa reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden donkey, holding it so the sunlight caught the smooth curves her father had carved. He made this for her before he died. It was the last gift he ever gave, carved from a piece of pine that fell during a thunderstorm. Dawn carried it everywhere, and later she passed it down to me. Ben leaned forward, studying the small carving. It doesn't look like much. The most important things rarely do, Willa replied. Your great-grandmother learned that lesson when she found a real donkey dying in this very clearing. The animal had been abandoned by traders who cared more about their schedule than the life of a sick creature. She gestured toward the far side of the clearing, where a game trail wound between the trees. Dawn was gathering herbs for her mother when she heard the animal's labored breathing. She could have walked away. Most people would have. The adults in her village certainly told her to. They said it was nature's way, that interfering with a dying animal was foolish and potentially dangerous. So what did she do? Ben asked, his earlier skepticism giving way to genuine curiosity. Willa smiled, remembering Luna's voice as she had told this same story decades earlier. She looked into that donkey's eyes and saw the same pain she carried in her own heart. The animal was fevered, covered in infected wounds, barely breathing. Any reasonable person would have walked away, but Dawn wasn't interested in being reasonable. She was interested in being kind. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of pine resin and wildflowers. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out, its voice echoing across the mountainside. Willa let the silence stretch between them, knowing that the best stories, like the best medicines, needed time to work their way into the listener's heart. The donkey had a name, she continued finally. The traders had called him Burden because that's all they saw when they looked at him, a beast to carry their loads until he was no longer useful. But Dawn saw something different. She saw a creature who had worked faithfully until sickness overtook him, then been abandoned by the very people he had served. Ben was quiet now, his phone forgotten in his pocket. Despite his urban upbringing, he was beginning to understand that this wasn't just another family legend designed to teach him about his roots. This was something deeper, more personal. She named him Shadow, Willa said, her voice soft with memory, because he followed her everywhere once she began nursing him back to health. Every morning before dawn, she would slip out of their lodge and make her way here with whatever medicines she could gather. Luna knew what she was doing, but pretended not to, understanding that her daughter needed to heal something in herself as much as she needed to heal the donkey. The clearing seemed to pulse with life around them. The whisper of wind through branches, the distant chatter of squirrels, the gentle babble of the creek. Willa could feel the weight of all the stories this place held, all the lives that had intersected here across the decades. For weeks, Dawn tended to Shadow in secret, she continued. She cleaned his wounds, brought him water, fed him the sweetest grass from hidden meadows. She sang to him the healing songs Luna had taught her, and slowly, impossibly, the donkey began to recover. Ben was leaning forward now, caught up in the story despite himself. But what's the big deal? I mean, it's nice that she saved an animal, but how did that change history? Willa's expression grew serious. Because sometimes, Ben, the smallest acts of kindness have the largest consequences. Dawn thought she was just saving one dying animal. She had no idea that her compassion would expose a web of corruption that reached all the way to the territorial government, or that her courage would inspire an entire community to stand up against injustice. She stood up from the log and walked to the center of the clearing, her footsteps silent on the soft earth. The traders who abandoned Shadow weren't just cruel, they were criminals. And when they came back looking for their property, they brought with them a conflict that would test everything Dawn believed about right and wrong. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees, casting long shadows across the meadow. In that golden light, it was easy to imagine a young girl kneeling beside a sick animal, whispering words of comfort and hope. Easy to picture. The moment when kindness overcame fear, when compassion triumphed over convenience. The hardest part, Willa said, returning to sit beside her grandson, wasn't nursing Shadow back to health. It was what came after, when Dawn had to choose between her safety and her principles, between fitting in and standing up. That's when a little girl became a leader, and when one act of mercy changed the course of multiple lives. Ben was quiet for a long moment, processing what he had heard. Finally, he looked up at his grandmother with new respect in his eyes. So what happened? How did saving a donkey change history? Willa smiled and tucked the wooden carving back into her pocket. That little wolf is where our story really begins. The morning of June 15th, 1887, dawned clear and cool, with mist rising from the creek like spirits dancing in the early light. 8-year-old Dawn Crowwing moved through the forest with the practiced silence her mother had taught her, a woven basket slung over her small shoulder. Luna had sent her to gather fever root from the high meadows, but Dawn had chosen to take the long path through the trading route, hoping, as she did every morning, that she might find something that needed her help. She had always been drawn to wounded things. Luna said it was a gift from the spirits, this ability to sense suffering and feel compelled to ease it. But sometimes Dawn thought it felt more like a burden. The world held so much pain, and she was only 8 years old. The bundle of fever root in her basket caught her attention, the precious medicinal herbs Luna used to break dangerous fevers. Dawn had watched her mother prepare countless remedies. With these gnarled, bitter roots, had seen them bring children back from the edge of death. She fingered the deerskin wrapping that protected the valuable medicine, feeling the weight of responsibility her mother had placed in her small hands. A sound stopped her in her tracks, a labored, wheezing breath that didn't belong to any wild animal she knew. Dawn froze, listening intently. There it was again, coming from the direction of the old trading camp. Her heart began to race as she crept forward, moving from tree to tree until she could see into the clearing where pack trains sometimes rested. What she saw there would haunt her for the rest of her life. A donkey lay on its side, near the cold. Remains of a campfire, its coat matted with sweat and mud. Even from a distance, Dawn could see the animal's ribs heaving with each difficult breath. Infected wounds covered its back and flanks, some from poorly fitted pack saddles, others from what looked like deliberate cruelty. Its eyes were half closed, filmed with fever, and flies buzzed around the worst of its injuries. Dawn's first instinct was to run for her mother, but something in the donkey's labored breathing told her there might not be time. The animal was dying. She could sense it with the same intuition that told her when storms were coming or when the winter would be harsh. She approached slowly, speaking in the soft Lakota words Luna used when treating frightened animals. "Hiya, Takosa," she whispered. "I see you, little brother. I see your pain." The donkey's eyes fluttered open at the sound of her voice. In those dark, pain-filled depths, Dawn saw something that made her chest tight with recognition. It was the same look she had seen in her own reflection after her father's death, the bewilderment of being abandoned, the confusion of suffering without understanding why. She knelt beside the animal, close enough to feel the heat radiating from its fevered body. The wounds were worse than she had first thought. Deep cuts from rough rope and metal buckles had become infected, and what looked like deliberate burns marked the donkey's shoulders. Dawn had to clench her fists to keep from crying at the evidence of such casual cruelty. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. Only humans could inflict this kind of systematic suffering on a creature that had served them faithfully. The memory of her father's death rushed over her without warning. She had been 6 then, old enough to understand that he wasn't coming, home from the hunting trip that had gone wrong, but too young to understand why the world seemed so suddenly dangerous and unreliable. For months afterward, she had felt abandoned by forces beyond her control, left to suffer in a world that suddenly made no sense. Looking at the donkey now, she saw that same abandonment reflected back at her. This animal had worked until it could. Work no more, had carried burdens until its body broke down, and then been left to die alone when it was no longer useful. The injustice of it made her small hands shake with anger, but anger wasn't going to save this creature. Dawn forced herself to think practically, to remember everything Luna had taught her about healing. The donkey needed water first. Its tongue was swollen and dark with dehydration. There was a clean spring not far from here, and she could fashion a container from broad leaves. She worked quickly, driven by urgency she could feel in her bones. Using her gathering basket, she carried water from the spring and carefully dribbled it between the donkey's cracked lips. The animal's eyes focused on her with something that might have been gratitude, and it managed to swallow a few precious drops. Next came the fever. Dawn unwrapped the bundle of fever root from her basket, hesitating only a moment before using some of the precious medicine. Luna would understand. She had taught Dawn that healing was always worth the cost. She chewed a small piece of the bitter root until it formed a paste, then carefully applied it to the donkey's burning forehead. The animal's breathing seemed to ease slightly, and Dawn allowed herself a moment of hope. But she knew this was only the beginning. The infected wounds would need constant care, and the donkey would need food and shelter if it was going to survive. This wasn't something she could accomplish in a single morning. She looked around the abandoned campsite, taking in the evidence of the traders' hasty departure. Scattered gear, cold ashes, and the distinctive wheel marks of heavily loaded wagons told the story clearly enough. They had left in a hurry, probably when the donkey became too sick to carry its load. Rather than lose time caring for a suffering animal, they had simply abandoned it to die. Dawn made a decision that would change the course of her life and the lives of everyone around her. She couldn't carry the donkey home. It was too large and too weak to move. But she could come back, every day if necessary, until the animal was either healed or had died with dignity rather than alone. Standing up from beside the donkey, Dawn felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since her father's death, she had found something she could actually fix, something she could save. The feeling was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. "I'll be back," she promised the donkey, stroking its matted mane. every day, until you're strong enough to choose your own path. No one should die alone. As she made her way home through the forest, Dawn's mind raced with plans. She would need more medicine, food for the donkey, and tools to clean its wounds. Properly. Most importantly, she would need to keep this secret from the adults in her village, at least until she could prove that her intervention was working. She knew they would try to stop her. Luna might understand, but the village elders would see only a child interfering with the natural order. They would say that death was part of life, that animals suffered and died all the time, that it was foolish to risk her safety for a creature that white traders had already written off as worthless. But Dawn had looked into the donkey's eyes and seen a reflection of her own pain. She had felt the fever burning through its body and remembered the helplessness of watching her father slip away. This time, she was going to fight back against the forces that told her to accept suffering as inevitable. Walking back toward her village, with her basket now lighter by several precious roots, Dawn Crowwing began the transformation from grieving child to determined healer. She didn't know that her act of compassion would eventually expose corruption that reached the highest levels of territorial government. She didn't know that her courage would inspire her entire community to stand up against injustice. All she knew was that a creature was dying alone, and she had the power to change that. Everything else would follow from that simple, powerful decision to choose kindness over convenience, compassion over conformity. The donkey would live. Dawn would make sure of that no matter what it cost her. For 6 days, Dawn lived a double life. Each morning before the sun touched the pine tops, she would slip from her family's lodge with a small parfleche bag containing whatever medicines and food she could gather without arousing suspicion. The walk to the trading camp took nearly an hour through forest paths that grew more familiar with each journey, and she used the time to practice the healing songs Luna had taught her. The donkey, whom she had secretly named Shadow because of how he seemed to blend into the darker patches of the forest, was stronger each day. His fever had broken on the 3rd morning, and he had managed to stand briefly on the 4th. By the 6th day, he was drinking steadily from the stream and showing interest in the sweet grass Dawn brought from hidden meadows. But the most remarkable change was in his eyes. The dull resignation she had first seen there was being replaced by something that looked almost like hope. When Dawn approached each morning, Shadow would lift his head and make a soft, whickering sound that seemed to say he had been waiting for her. The trading post ledger she had found scattered near the old campfire told a story that made her stomach sick. The water-stained pages contained records of animals worked to death, sold sick, or abandoned when they became inconvenient. Jeremiah Cross, the trader captain whose name appeared on every page, seemed to view animals as nothing more than disposable tools. The casual cruelty documented in his neat handwriting made Dawn understand that Shadow's abandonment was not an accident, but a deliberate choice. "You were never just a burden," she whispered to Shadow as she carefully cleaned his wounds. "With moss soaked in clean stream water. You have a name and a spirit, just like any of us." The animal's wounds were healing well under her care, but Dawn knew she was walking a dangerous line. Her absences from the village were becoming harder to explain, and Luna's sharp eyes missed. Very little. Her mother had begun asking pointed questions about why Dawn's gathering baskets came back lighter than usual, and why certain medicines seemed to disappear from their family's stores. More troubling were the rumors filtering through the village about the return of Cross's trading party. According to the gossip Dawn overheard from the adult conversations, the traders had realized they were missing valuable property and were retracing their route. The village council was already nervous about potential conflicts with white traders, and Dawn knew that any discovery of her secret would put her entire family at risk. Standing bare, the village elder whose counsel was sought on all important matters had made his position clear during the previous evening's council meeting. Dawn had hidden behind her family's lodge to listen, her heart pounding as she heard him speak about the importance of avoiding entanglements with white man's business. "We cannot afford to be seen as thieves or meddlers," Standing Bear had said, his weathered voice carrying the authority of 7 decades. "The territorial government grows more suspicious of our people every year. If we are accused of stealing property, even worthless property, it could bring soldiers to our village." Dawn's hands trembled as she remembered those words. What she was doing could be seen as theft, even though the traders had clearly abandoned Shadow to die. White man's law didn't recognize the same concepts of animal welfare that her people practiced. To them, an animal was property until the moment its owner chose to discard it, and then it became no one's responsibility. But as she watched Shadow graze contentedly in the morning sunlight, his coat beginning to regain its natural shine, Dawn knew she couldn't abandon him now. He trusted her completely, following her movements with intelligent eyes and coming when she called his name. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day, built on the foundation of care freely, given and gratefully received. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Dawn's blood freeze. She grabbed Shadow's makeshift lead rope, fashioned from braided grass, and led him quickly into the thick brush that bordered the clearing. They had practiced this hiding routine several times, and Shadow seemed to understand the need for silence. Through the screen of leaves, Dawn watched as 3 men on horseback rode into the clearing. She recognized the leader immediately from the description she had heard around the village. Jeremiah Cross, a tall man with graying hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. His clothing was expensive but practical, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "This is where we camped 6 nights ago," Cross said to his companions, dismounting and examining the cold fire ring. "The beast should be dead by now, but I want to see the carcass. Need to make sure no one can say we abandoned valuable property." Dawn pressed herself closer to the ground, one hand on Shadow's neck to keep him calm. The donkey seemed to sense danger and remained perfectly still, his breathing barely audible. "Don't see no dead donkey, Captain," said one of the other men, a thin fellow with nervous eyes. "Maybe wolves drug it off somewhere." Cross's expression darkened. "Or maybe someone took it. Check for tracks, signs of human presence. If some Indian found that animal and nursed it back to health, we've got a problem." Dawn's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the men search the clearing. They found evidence of her presence, and quickly enough, the indentations where she had knelt beside Shadow, the remains of her small cooking fires, even some of the grass ropes she had used to secure medicine bundles. "Someone's been here regular," Cross announced, examining a fragment. "Of braided sweetgrass. Taking care of something by the look of it. This is Indian work, I'd recognize that weaving anywhere." The thin man shifted nervously in his saddle. "What do we do now, Captain? If they got your donkey, then they stole my property," Cross interrupted, his voice sharp with anger. "And I intend to get it back, along with compensation for the inconvenience. That animal represents a significant investment, and I won't have savages thinking they can help themselves to my goods." Dawn's mind raced as she listened to their conversation. Cross wasn't just angry about losing property. He was looking for an excuse to cause trouble for her people. The donkey had become a symbol of something larger, a focal point for the tensions that always simmered between the white traders and the native communities they passed through. As the men prepared to leave, Cross turned back to survey the clearing one more time. "Spread the word when we get back to the post," he told his companions. "I want everyone to know that the Crow Wing Band has been harboring stolen property. Time to remind these people about the consequences of interfering with lawful business." After the hoofbeats faded into silence, Dawn remained hidden for a long time, her arms around Shadow's neck as she tried to process what she had heard. Her act of compassion had become something much more dangerous, a potential catalyst for conflict between her people and the territorial authorities. But as she looked into Shadow's trusting eyes, Dawn knew she couldn't abandon him now. Whatever consequences might come, she had made a promise to a dying creature, and she intended to keep it. The little girl who had started this journey to save one animal was beginning to understand that sometimes standing up for what's right means standing up against the whole world. Luna Crow Wing had been watching her daughter's morning departures for 3 days before she decided to follow. As a medicine woman, she had learned to read the subtle signs that revealed hidden truths. The way Dawn's hands trembled slightly as she prepared her gathering basket, the careful way she packed extra food, the guilty glance toward her mother's medicine bundles when she thought no one was looking. The forest mist was just beginning to lift when Luna set out on Dawn's trail, moving through the underbrush with the silent grace that had made her reputation as both healer and hunter. She had been tracking for less than an hour when she heard her daughter's voice drifting through the trees, not the halting, uncertain speech Dawn used around the village adults, but confident words sung in the old healing language. Luna crept closer until she could see into the clearing, and what she witnessed there stopped her breath in her chest. Dawn knelt beside a healthy donkey, her small hands moving with practiced skill as she cleaned a healing wound on the animal's flank. The prayer beads Luna used for her most serious healing ceremonies were wrapped around Dawn's wrist, their carved wooden beads catching the morning light. But it wasn't the sight of her daughter performing advanced healing techniques that made Luna's heart swell with pride and fear in equal measure. It was the way the donkey responded to Dawn's touch, with complete trust and obvious affection. This was not a child playing at being a medicine woman. This was a healer at work, regardless of her age. Luna remained hidden, watching as Dawn finished her treatment and began gathering fresh grass for the animal to eat. The donkey, whom she heard Dawn call Shadow, followed her movements with intelligent eyes and made soft sounds of contentment when she spoke to him. The bond between them was unmistakable, built on weeks of patient care and mutual trust. When Dawn prepared to leave for the village, Luna made her decision. She stepped into the clearing, moving slowly so as not to startle either her daughter or the donkey. Dawn's face went white with fear and guilt when she saw her mother. "Aina," she whispered, using the old word for mother. "I can explain." "There is nothing to explain, Takoja," Luna said gently, approaching the donkey with her hands open and visible. Shadow tensed at her approach but didn't flee, apparently trusting Dawn's calm demeanor. "You found a creature in need and chose to heal rather than ignore. This is what we do." The relief that flooded Dawn's face was almost heartbreaking. "You're not angry." Luna knelt beside her daughter and examined Shadow with experienced eyes. The donkey's coat was glossy with health, his wounds had healed cleanly, and his bright eyes showed no sign of the fever that had nearly killed him. Dawn's care had been skillful and thorough, better than many adult healers could have managed. "I am proud," Luna said simply, "and I am frightened. Do you understand what you have done?" Dawn's expression grew serious. "I saved him, yes, but in doing so you have taken responsibility for the consequences of that choice. The traders who abandoned this animal will return, and when they do, they will not see a merciful child who saved a suffering creature. They will see a thief who stole their property." Luna reached into her medicine pouch and withdrew the string of prayer beads she had given Dawn. The carved wooden spheres were smooth with age and use, each one representing a different aspect of the healing arts. "These belonged to my grandmother, and her grandmother before that. When I gave them to you, I thought you would grow into their power gradually, over many years." She fastened the beads around Dawn's wrist with ceremonial precision, but power chooses its own time to manifest. You have already proven yourself worthy of these beads through your care for Shadow. Now you must prove yourself worthy of the responsibility they represent. Dawn touched the beads reverently, feeling their weight both physical and spiritual. "What does that mean?" "It means that healers must sometimes heal more than bodies," Luna explained, settling cross-legged on the grass beside Shadow. The donkey had relaxed completely in her presence, recognizing another practitioner of the healing arts. Sometimes we must heal communities, relationships, the bonds between different peoples. And sometimes that healing requires us to stand in dangerous places. She gestured toward the forest paths that led to the white settlements. Word has reached our village that the trader captain, Cross, is telling stories about stolen property. He claims our people are thieves and that we cannot be trusted. These stories will reach the territorial governor, and they will be used to justify harsh measures against all native communities. Dawn's stomach twisted with guilt. I didn't mean to cause trouble for everyone. Of course you didn't, Luna said, stroking Shadow's neck as the donkey nuzzled her hand. But good intentions do not prevent consequences. The question now is not what you meant to do, but what you will choose to do as these consequences unfold. She reached into her medicine bundle and withdrew a piece of sage wrapped in red cloth. Your healing of Shadow has given our people something more valuable than they yet realize, proof that Cross's stories about animal care are lies. This donkey should be dead if Cross treated his animals well. Instead, he is healthy and strong. Evidence of neglect and abandonment. Dawn looked puzzled. I don't understand. Luna's expression grew grave. Cross has contracts with the territorial government to provide healthy animals for military use. If officials discover that he regularly works animals to death and abandons the sick ones, those contracts will be cancelled and he will face criminal charges. That is why he is so desperate to retrieve Shadow, not because the animal is valuable, but because Shadow's health proves Cross's claims about animal mortality are fraudulent. The weight of this revelation settled over Dawn like a heavy blanket. She had thought she was simply saving one suffering creature, but her act of compassion had inadvertently exposed a much larger pattern of corruption and cruelty. What happens now? Dawn asked in a small voice. Luna stood and helped her daughter to her feet. Now we go home and prepare. Cross will come to our village soon, demanding the return of his property. When he does, we must be ready to make a choice. Surrender. Shadow to protect our community's safety, or stand firm and defend what we know to be right. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Shadow followed them several steps before stopping at the edge of the forest. He seemed to understand that he couldn't come to the village, but his eyes remained fixed on Dawn with an expression of complete trust. He believes you will protect him, Luna observed, watching the interaction between her daughter and the donkey. That is a sacred responsibility, Takoja. Animals give their trust rarely and completely. To betray it is to damage something precious. In the world, walking home through the morning forest, mother and daughter carried with them the knowledge that their quiet lives were about to become very complicated indeed. The sacred eagle feather that Standing Bear placed in Dawn's small hands felt impossibly light and impossibly heavy at the same time. The village elder's weathered face was grave as he spoke the old words of protection, but his eyes held a pride that made Dawn's chest tight with emotion. This feather comes from a golden eagle that chose to give its life to protect its young, Standing Bear explained, his voice carrying the authority of 7 decades spent walking between the spirit world and the world of men. It carries the eagle's courage and wisdom. You will need both in the days ahead. 3 days had passed since Cross's ultimatum reached the village. The trader captain's messenger had been clear and threatening. Return the stolen donkey within 1 week or face the consequences of harboring thieves. The entire community was divided on how to respond, and Dawn found herself at the center of a conflict that threatened to tear her people apart. Some families, led by Broken Arrow and his sons, argued for surrendering Shadow immediately. We cannot risk bringing the army down on our village for the sake of one animal, Broken Arrow had declared during the heated council meeting the night before. The child meant well, but she has put us all in danger with her foolishness. Others including Luna and several of the younger warriors, believed that giving in to Cross's threats would only invite further intimidation. "If we surrender what is rightfully ours today," Luna had responded, "what will they demand tomorrow? Our horses, our children? There must be a line we will not cross." But it was Standing Bear's words that carried the most weight, and his position surprised everyone. The elder who had always counseled caution and diplomacy had taken Dawn's side, arguing that sometimes a community's character was defined by how it treated its most vulnerable members, whether human or animal. "The child saw suffering and chose to heal," Standing Bear had said, his voice cutting through the arguments like a blade through cloth. "That is the essence of what we are as a people. If we abandon that principle to appease bullies, we abandon ourselves." Now, as Dawn knelt before the elder in the pre-dawn darkness, she felt the full weight of the community's expectations settling on her small shoulders. The eagle feather in her hands seemed to pulse with its own energy, connecting her to generations of warriors and healers who had faced impossible choices. "I'm scared, grandfather," she whispered, using the honorary title that showed respect for Standing Bear's wisdom and age. "Good," the elder replied, his lined face softening slightly. "Fear keeps us alert and humble, but do not let it keep you from doing what your heart knows is right." The sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air, coming from the direction of the territorial road. Dawn's stomach clenched as she recognized the rhythm of multiple riders moving with military precision. Cross had arrived, and he had brought friends. Standing Bear rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and placed a protective hand on Dawn's shoulder. "Remember, Takosa, courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to act with honor. Despite fear, today you will teach the adults in this village what it means to stand for something greater than themselves." As the riders entered the village clearing, Dawn counted 7 men on horseback, led by the imposing figure of Jeremiah Cross. But it was the 8th rider who made her blood run cold. A young cavalry officer in full military dress, his uniform crisp and his bearing suggesting recent graduation from West Point. Lieutenant Marcus Hayes dismounted with practiced efficiency and surveyed the village with calculating eyes. He was perhaps 25 years old, with sandy hair and the kind of clean-shaven appearance that spoke of privilege and education. But there was something in his expression that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with his current assignment. Cross, meanwhile, sat his horse like a man accustomed to looking down on others. His cold blue eyes swept the village until they found Dawn, and his lips curved in what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," Cross announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent village. "A pack animal that was abandoned due to illness and subsequently stolen by persons unknown." Luna emerged from her lodge, moving with the quiet dignity that had made her reputation as both healer and diplomat. Behind her came other families, arranging themselves in the traditional semicircle used for formal negotiations. Dawn noticed that even Broken Arrow and his supporters had come, their faces tense but determined to present a united front. "We know of no stolen property," Luna replied calmly. "If an animal was found suffering and tended by compassionate hands, that is our way. We do not abandon creatures to die alone." Cross's expression darkened. "Your way is theft, woman. I have witnesses who saw my property alive and well after it should have been dead. Someone in this village interfered with natural law and stole from me." Lieutenant Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, and Dawn caught something in his expression that surprised her, doubt, perhaps even embarrassment. This was not a man who enjoyed threatening children and families, whatever his orders might be. Natural law. Standing Bear stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. "Is it natural law to work an animal until it collapses, then abandon it to suffer? Is it natural law to show no mercy to creatures that have served faithfully?" Cross's face flushed with anger. How I treat my property is no concern of yours, old man. I want my donkey returned immediately, along with compensation for the time and trouble your people have cost me." Dawn felt the eagle feather warm in her palm, and suddenly she knew what she had to do. Before Standing Bear or Luna could respond, she stepped forward, her young voice cutting through the tension like a stone through still water. "Shadow belongs to no one," she said clearly, her fear transforming into something that felt like power. "He was dying and abandoned. I healed him because that is what we do. We help those who cannot help themselves. If you want to claim him, now you must first explain why you left him to die." The silence that followed her words was absolute. Every adult eye in the village turned toward her, some with pride, others with terror at her boldness. Cross's face went white with rage, but it was Lieutenant Hayes who spoke first. "Shadow?" the young officer asked, his voice carefully neutral. "That's what you call the animal?" Dawn nodded, clutching the eagle feather tighter. "He follows me. Like a shadow, faithful and true. He trusts me to protect him." Hayes's expression grew thoughtful, and Dawn sensed an opportunity she didn't fully understand. Something in the officer's bearing suggested he was not entirely convinced by Cross's version of events. "Perhaps," Hayes said slowly, "we should examine this animal before deciding questions of ownership and theft. If it is indeed healthy and well cared for, that would seem to contradict certain official reports I have received." The broken trading chain that Dawn found half buried near Shadow's recovery site was thick with rust and bent from years of harsh use. As she held the heavy iron links in her hands, she could almost feel the weight of suffering they represented. Countless animals restrained, controlled, and ultimately discarded when they were no longer useful. 2 days had passed since Cross's confrontation with the village, and his ultimatum hung over everyone like storm clouds on the horizon. Return the donkey by sunset tomorrow, or face the consequences of defying territorial law. But Lieutenant Hayes's unexpected interest in examining Shadow had introduced a new element of uncertainty to the situation. Dawn had spent the morning with Shadow in their secret clearing, trying to process the complexity of what was happening around her. The donkey seemed to sense her anxiety, staying close and making the soft, whickering sounds that had become their private language of comfort and reassurance. "I don't know what to do," she whispered to him, stroking his mane as he grazed peacefully. "Everyone is fighting because of us. Maybe Broken Arrow is right. Maybe I should have left you alone." Shadow lifted his head at the sadness in her voice, nuzzling her shoulder with the gentle insistence that always made her smile despite her troubles. His complete trust in her had never wavered, not even when she had been clumsy with his treatments or when her healing songs had been interrupted by tears of frustration. The sound of approaching footsteps made Dawn tense, but she relaxed when she recognized Luna's familiar gait. Her mother emerged from the forest, accompanied by someone unexpected, Lieutenant Hayes, walking alone and unarmed, his military bearing somehow less intimidating without his horse and weapons. "Dawn," Luna called softly. "Lieutenant Hayes has asked to meet Shadow properly. He comes as a guest, not an enemy." The young officer stopped at the edge of the clearing, his eyes taking in the scene with obvious surprise. Shadow was clearly healthy and well cared for, his coat glossy and his movements strong and confident. This was not the picture of a stolen, neglected animal that Cross's reports had painted. "Ma'am," Hayes said formally to Dawn, removing his cap in a gesture of respect that surprised her. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I wanted to see for myself the animal that has caused such discussion." Dawn studied his face carefully, using the intuition Luna had taught her to read people's true intentions. What she saw there was not the cold authority she had expected, but genuine curiosity mixed with something that looked like doubt. "You can approach him," Dawn said finally, "but move slowly. He's learned to be careful around strangers." Hayes nodded and walked toward Shadow with deliberate calm, his hands visible and non-threatening. The donkey watched him approach but didn't retreat. apparently reassured by Dawn's calm demeanor. "He's magnificent," Hayes said softly, running an experienced hand along Shadow's flank. "Healthy coat, clear eyes, good muscle tone. This animal has been expertly cared for." He paused, examining old scars on Shadow's back and shoulders. "These wounds, they're from pack saddles that were never properly fitted. And these burns—" "Cross did those," Dawn said quietly, "before he abandoned Shadow to die." Hayes' expression hardened as he continued his examination. "In my report to the territorial governor, Captain Cross claimed that pack animals in his care received the finest treatment available. He attributed animal deaths to disease and natural causes beyond his control." Luna stepped closer, her healer's instincts recognizing the significance of Hayes' words. "And what do you see here, Lieutenant?" "I see evidence of systematic abuse," Hayes replied grimly. "These scars tell a story of cruelty, not care. If this animal was indeed abandoned by Cross's party, then his official reports contain deliberate falsehoods." Dawn felt a flutter of hope in her chest. "Does that mean Shadow can stay with us?" Hayes was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing loyalties. "The situation is more complicated than simple ownership, miss. Captain Cross holds federal contracts to provide animals for military use. If his treatment of those animals violates the terms of those contracts—" He didn't finish the thought, but Dawn could see the wheels turning in his mind. Luna, with her years of experience reading people's intentions, pressed the advantage. "Lieutenant, you seem like a man who values truth. Would you be willing to hear the full story of what my daughter found in this clearing?" Over the next hour, Dawn told Hayes everything. Finding Shadow dying, the weeks of careful treatment, the evidence in Cross's ledger of systematic animal abuse. Hayes listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When Dawn finished, Hayes was quiet for several minutes, absently stroking Shadow's neck as the donkey dozed in the afternoon sunshine. Finally, he looked up at Luna with something like determination in his eyes. "Mrs. Crow-Wing, I came here expecting to investigate a simple case of theft. Instead, I find evidence of federal contract fraud and animal cruelty. This changes everything." Dawn's heart leaped, but Luna remained cautious. "What does that mean?" "For our village, for Shadow. It means," Hayes said slowly, "that I need to conduct a thorough investigation before any decisions are made about this animal's fate. It also means that Captain Cross's threats against your community may be based on false premises." As they prepared to leave the clearing, Hayes turned back to Dawn with an expression of genuine respect. "Miss, what you did here, saving this animal, standing up for what you believed was right despite the consequences, that took real courage. I want you to know that I will not forget it." Walking back toward the village, Dawn felt the weight of the eagle feather in her pocket and the broken chain in her hand. These symbols seemed to represent two different futures, one where might made right and the weak were discarded, and another where compassion and courage could challenge even the most entrenched systems of cruelty. That evening, the village council met again, but this time the discussion had a different tone. Hayes had requested permission to examine Cross's other animals and interview witnesses about the trader's business practices. The investigation that Dawn had accidentally triggered by saving Shadow was beginning to reveal a pattern of abuse that reached far beyond one abandoned donkey. "The child has done more than save an animal," Standing Bear observed, his weathered hands gesturing toward the eagle feather that now hung from a place of honor in Dawn's hair. "She has exposed corruption that threatened our entire community and given us an ally where we expected to find an enemy." As Dawn fell asleep that night, Shadow's image filled her dreams. But now he wasn't alone in the forest clearing. He was surrounded by other animals, all of them healthy and free, no longer bearing the scars of human cruelty. The broken chain lay discarded in the grass, and Dawn knew that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance could break the strongest bonds of oppression. The military commission papers that Lieutenant Hayes spread across Standing Bear's lodge floor told a story that none of them had expected. In the flickering light of the council fire, the official documents revealed a truth that changed everything. They thought they knew about the confrontation with Cross. "I wasn't sent here to investigate stolen property," Hayes said quietly, his young face grave in the firelight. "I was sent to investigate Captain Jeremiah Cross for systematic fraud against the United States government." Dawn sat beside her mother, the eagle feather in her hair catching the light as she leaned forward to better understand the papers Hayes was showing them. The documents were covered in official seals and signatures, but their meaning was clear enough. Cross had been under federal investigation for months. Standing Bear's weathered fingers traced the edge of one document as he absorbed its implications. "How long have you known Cross was a criminal?" "The investigation began 6 months ago," Hayes replied, rolling up one of the commission papers. "Cross has contracts to provide healthy animals for military use throughout the territory. His reports consistently claim that animals die from disease and natural causes, but the mortality rates he reports are far higher than any other contractor." Luna's eyes flashed with understanding. "He's been working the animals to death, then claiming they died naturally to cover his cruelty." "Exactly, and billing the government for replacement animals that he purchases at far below market rates." Hayes gestured toward Dawn, who was listening with wide eyes. "When your daughter saved Shadow, she accidentally preserved evidence that contradicts Cross's official reports. A healthy, recovered donkey proves that his claims about unavoidable animal deaths are lies." The revelation hit Dawn like a physical blow. All this time, she had thought she was simply saving one suffering creature. She hadn't realized that Shadow's recovery would expose a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "That's why Cross is so desperate to get Shadow back," she said slowly, pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "Not because Shadow is valuable, but because a healthy donkey proves Cross has been lying about everything." Hayes nodded grimly. "Shadow's existence contradicts every report Cross has filed about animal care and mortality. If government investigators see a donkey that was supposed to die, but was instead nursed back to health by a child using simple remedies, Cross's entire operation collapses." Standing Bear leaned back, his expression mixing admiration with concern. "So the child's act of compassion has trapped a criminal." "More than that," Hayes continued, his voice growing excited. "Cross's desperation has made him reckless. His threats against your village, his attempts to intimidate witnesses, these are federal crimes. Every word he spoke here yesterday was documented by witnesses and constitutes obstruction of a federal investigation." Dawn felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening around her. "I just wanted to help Shadow. I didn't mean to start all this." Luna placed a protective arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Sometimes, Takoja, the spirits guide us to actions whose significance we cannot see until later. You chose compassion when you could have chosen indifference. Everything else flows from that choice." Hayes gathered his papers with careful precision, his military training evident in the methodical way he organized the documents. "The situation has become much more complex than a simple dispute over animal ownership. Cross knows he's being investigated, and Shadow represents evidence that could send him to federal prison." "What does that mean for our village?" Standing Bear asked, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility for his people's safety. "It means Cross is cornered and dangerous," Hayes replied honestly. "A man facing federal prison will do desperate things to eliminate evidence and silence witnesses. He sees your entire community as a threat to his freedom." The implications of Hayes's words settled over the lodge like smoke from the council fire. Dawn had thought the worst that could happen was losing Shadow. Now she realized that her entire family, her whole village, was in danger because of her decision to save a dying animal. "There's something else," Hayes continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Cross has been using his trade routes to smuggle weapons to hostile elements in the territory. The animal abuse was just the beginning. We suspect him of much more serious crimes." Luna's face went pale. Weapons. What kind of weapons? Rifles, ammunition, supplies that could be used to arm raiders or renegade groups. Cross's trading routes take him through some of the most sensitive areas in the territory, and his official status gives him access to places ordinary criminals couldn't reach. Dawn felt sick as the full scope of Cross's criminality became clear. Her simple act of healing had accidentally exposed not just animal abuse, but a conspiracy that threatened the safety of communities throughout the region. Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, processing the enormity of what they had learned. Finally, he looked up at Hayes, with the direct gaze that had made him a respected leader for decades. "What do you need from us, Lieutenant?" Hayes's expression grew determined. "I need your help to bring Cross to justice. Your daughter's testimony about finding Shadow, the evidence of his recovery, the documentation of Cross's threats, all of it is crucial to building a case that will hold up in federal court." "And Shadow?" Dawn asked, her voice small with worry. "Shadow stays with you," Hayes said firmly. "He's evidence in a federal investigation, which means he's under government protection. Cross has no legal claim to him whatsoever." Relief flooded through Dawn, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Cross wouldn't give up easily. A man facing federal prison for fraud and weapon smuggling wouldn't be deterred by legal technicalities. "He'll try to take Shadow anyway," Dawn said, the certainty of it settling in her stomach like a cold stone. "He can't let Shadow live to testify against him." Hayes nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of. Cross's deadline expires tomorrow. At sunset, when he comes for Shadow, he won't be coming to negotiate. He'll be coming to eliminate evidence and silence witnesses." Standing, Bear rose from his place by the fire, his movements deliberate and purposeful. "Then we must be ready for him. This is no longer about one child's compassion or one village's principles. This is about standing against a corruption that threatens all our people." As the council meeting broke up, Dawn walked outside into the cool evening air, her mind reeling from everything she had learned. The eagle feather in her hair stirred in the breeze, and she could almost feel the weight of her ancestors' expectations settling on her shoulders. Tomorrow, Cross would come for Shadow, but he would find more than a frightened village and a stubborn child. He would find a community united in defense of justice, backed by federal authority, and determined to see that courage triumphed over corruption. Dawn touched the wooden donkey in her pocket, the toy her father had carved so many years ago. He had taught her that every creature deserved compassion, but she was learning that sometimes compassion required courage, and sometimes courage required standing against forces much larger and more dangerous than herself. The little girl who had found a dying donkey was gone. In her place stood a young healer who had accidentally exposed a criminal conspiracy and would now help bring it to justice. The war paint symbols that Luna traced on Dawn's face in the pre-dawn darkness were older than memory, passed down through generations of crow-wing women who had faced impossible odds with nothing but courage and faith. Each mark carried meaning. The eagle for wisdom, the bear for strength, the turtle for endurance. As Luna's fingers moved with practiced precision, she whispered the ancient prayers that connected daughter to mother, present to past, mortal to eternal. "These symbols have protected our family for 7 generations, Luna said softly, her voice barely audible above the rustle of wind through the lodge covering. "Your great-great-grandmother wore them when she stood against cavalry soldiers who tried to force our people from this land. Your great-grandmother wore them when she faced a grizzly bear to protect her children. Now you wear them to face a different kind of danger." Dawn sat perfectly still as her mother completed the ritual, feeling the weight of ancestral strength settling into her bones. The paint was cool against her skin, but seemed to pulse with its own warmth, as if the spirits of all those previous generations were lending her their courage for the trial ahead. Outside, the village was transforming itself into something that Cross would never expect. What had begun as a simple demand for the return of stolen property had become a carefully planned operation to capture a federal fugitive. Lieutenant Hayes had spent the night coordinating with his superiors via telegraph, and by dawn, additional cavalry units were positioned throughout the surrounding forest. But the most important preparation was happening within the village itself. Families who had been divided by fear and uncertainty were now united in a common purpose. Even Broken Arrow, who had initially supported surrendering Shadow to avoid conflict, now stood ready to defend the community against Cross's criminal enterprise. Standing Bear moved through the village like a general preparing for battle, but this was a different kind of warfare than his generation had known. Instead of arrows and rifles, their weapons would be truth and justice, backed by federal law and the testimony of witnesses who had finally found the courage to speak. Cross will come at sunset, Hayes reported, joining the war council that had gathered in Standing Bear's lodge. My scouts confirm that he's assembled a group of armed men, not soldiers, but hired guns from the mining camps. He's planning to take Shadow by force and eliminate anyone who might testify against him. Dawn felt her stomach tighten with fear, but the war paint on her face seemed to steady her nerves. What about Shadow? He doesn't understand any of this. He just knows that people are angry and frightened. Shadow will be protected, Hayes assured her. My men have the entire clearing surrounded. When Cross arrives, he'll walk into a trap. But Dawn, you need to understand. This won't be like the movies where the bad guys give up when they realize they're outnumbered. Cross is facing life in federal prison. He'll fight. Luna finished packing her medicine bundle with supplies for treating wounds, her movements methodical despite the tension that filled the air. As a healer, she had learned to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. The herbs and bandages she carried might mean the difference between life and death before the day was over. There's something else you all need to know, Hayes continued, his expression growing even more grave. Our investigation has uncovered evidence that Cross has been planning something much larger than just retrieving Shadow. He's been using his trade routes to map military positions and supply lines throughout the territory. We believe he's been selling that information to hostile groups, planning coordinated attacks on settlements. The implications of this revelation rippled through the gathered council like shockwaves. Dawn's simple act of compassion had exposed not just animal abuse and fraud, but a conspiracy that threatened the safety of every family in the region. Standing Bear leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. How many people could die if Cross escapes justice? Hundreds, Hayes replied without hesitation. Maybe thousands. The information he's gathered could be used to coordinate attacks that would overwhelm our territorial defenses. This isn't just about one donkey anymore. It's about preventing a war. Dawn touched the eagle feather in her hair, feeling its power flowing through her like electricity. The terrified child who had hidden in the forest while Cross searched for signs of Shadow was gone. In her place sat a young woman who understood that sometimes individual courage was the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what they were facing. Hayes studied her face, taking in the war paint and the determined expression that reminded him of veteran soldiers he had known. I need you to be exactly who you are, the girl who saved Shadow when everyone told her to walk away. Cross thinks he's dealing with frightened villagers and a stubborn child. He doesn't realize he's walking into a confrontation with someone who has the backing of the federal government and the moral authority that comes from doing what's right. As the morning progressed, families throughout the village made their own preparations. Children were moved to safety in the deep forest, while adults took positions that would allow them to witness Cross's arrival without being caught in potential crossfire. The village that Cross expected to intimidate into submission was instead becoming a carefully orchestrated trap. Luna spent the day teaching Dawn advanced healing techniques, passing on knowledge that had been reserved for much older students. You may need these skills before the sun sets, she said, showing Dawn how to stop bleeding from serious wounds. A healer's work often begins when the fighting ends. Shadow seemed to sense the tension in the air, staying close to Dawn whenever. She visited the forest clearing. The donkey's recovery was complete now. His coat gleamed with health, his eyes were bright and alert, and his movements showed the strength and vitality that Cross's reports claimed was impossible for animals. In his care, "You saved my life," Dawn whispered to Shadow as she brushed his mane one last time before the confrontation. "Now you're going to help save a lot of other lives. I hope you understand how important you are." The donkey nuzzled her shoulder with the gentle affection that had become their special language, and Dawn knew that whatever happened in the hours ahead, she had made the right choice. The dying animal she had found in this clearing had become a symbol of something much larger, the idea that compassion and courage could triumph over cruelty and corruption. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Hayes made his final preparations. Federal marshals had arrived to assist with Cross's arrest, and the entire operation was now under official government control. But everyone understood that Dawn remained the key witness, the person whose testimony would make or break the case. Against Cross. "Are you ready?" Standing Bear asked, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Dawn looked around at her family, her village, the federal agents who had become unexpected allies. The war paint on her face felt like armor, and the eagle feather in her hair seemed to pulse with the wisdom of generations. She was 8 years old, but she carried the strength of all the women who had come before her. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. Cross would come expecting to find a frightened village and a defenseless child. Instead, he would discover that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance could expose the largest conspiracies, and that courage was not determined by age or size, but by the willingness to stand for what was right, regardless of the consequences. The battle for Shadow and for the safety of the entire territory was about to begin. The simple rope that Dawn had braided from sweetgrass and buffalo hair lay coiled in her hands like a promise. She had made it during the long weeks of Shadow's recovery, intending it as a lead rope that would never cut or chafe like the harsh chains Cross had used. Now, as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, that rope would become the symbol of trust that turned the tide of battle. Cross arrived exactly as Lieutenant Hayes had predicted, at sunset, with 6 armed men, flanking him like a personal army. But this time, he didn't bother with the pretense of legal authority or righteous indignation. His face was hard with desperate fury, and the rifle across his saddle left no doubt about his intentions. Dawn stood in the center of the village clearing, Shadow beside her, the braided rope loose in her hands. The war paint on her face caught the dying light, transforming her from a frightened child into something that looked ancient and powerful. Behind her, arranged in the traditional semicircle, stood her entire community, united not by fear, but by determination to see justice done. "I want my property!" Cross snarled, his horse dancing nervously beneath him as if sensing the tension in the air. "And I want the lying brats who stole it to face the consequences of their theft." "Shadow belongs to no one," Dawn replied, her voice carrying clearly across the silent clearing. The eagle feather in her hair stirred in the evening breeze, and she felt the strength of 7 generations flowing through her words. "You abandoned him to die. He chose to live, and he chose to stay with me." Cross's laugh was ugly and without humor. "A savage child thinks she can lecture me about property law? You have no rights here, girl. None of you do." That was when Lieutenant Hayes stepped out of the shadows at the forest edge, his uniform crisp and his badge gleaming in the fading light. Behind him came federal marshals and cavalry soldiers, their weapons ready but not yet raised. "Captain Cross," Hayes announced, his voice carrying the full authority of the United States government, "you are under arrest for federal contract, fraud, animal cruelty, weapons smuggling, and conspiracy against the territorial government." Cross's face went white, then flushed red with rage. "You have no authority here, boy. This is a civilian matter." "Actually," Hayes replied calmly, "this is a federal investigation, and you are a federal fugitive. Surrender now, and you'll be treated according to military law." But Cross had come too far and risked too much to surrender now. His hand moved toward the rifle on his saddle, and Dawn saw the madness of a cornered animal flash in his eyes. "If I can't have the donkey," Cross snarled, "then no one can." He raised his rifle toward Shadow, but Dawn was already moving. The braided rope in her hands became a bridge of trust as she spoke the word that had become their private language. Shadow, Iduni, the Lakota word for go home, sent the donkey into motion with the speed that had once made him valuable as a pack animal. But instead of fleeing, Shadow positioned himself between Dawn and Cross's rifle, his body shielding the girl who had saved his life. Cross's shot went wide as his horse shied away from the sudden movement. Shadow reared up on his hind legs, his hooves striking out at the mounted man who had once burned his flesh with hot irons. The donkey's loyalty wasn't just to Dawn, it was an active choice to fight alongside her against their common enemy. The clearing erupted into chaos as Cross's hired guns realized they were surrounded by federal agents. Most threw down their weapons immediately, unwilling to face charges of firing on government officers, but Cross himself, driven by desperation and fury, spurred his horse toward the forest trail that led away from the village. Hayes shouted orders as his men moved, to cut off Cross's escape routes. But the trader knew these paths better than the soldiers did, and his horse was fast and sure-footed on the rocky ground. Dawn made a decision that would be talked about in her village for generations. Still holding the braided rope, she swung onto Shadow's back with the fluid grace of someone who had spent weeks building trust with a frightened animal. "Stop!" Luna cried from behind her. "Dawn, let the soldiers handle this!" But Dawn was already in motion, Shadow responding to her guidance, as if they shared a single mind. The donkey's recovery had restored not just his health, but his speed and agility. As they pounded through the forest after Cross, Dawn felt the wind whipping through her hair and the steady rhythm of Shadow's hooves, carrying them toward a confrontation that would determine not just their fate, but the fate of countless innocent people throughout the territory. Cross glanced back and saw them coming, a painted child on a donkey that should have been dead, pursuing him through the forest like an avenging spirit, his face twisted with a mixture of fear and rage as he realized that everything he had tried to destroy was now hunting him down. The federal marshal's badge that Lieutenant Hayes wore caught the last rays of sunlight as he emerged from the forest, his weapon drawn, but his voice steady with the authority of law and justice. Behind him came the sound of approaching cavalry, the thunder of hooves that meant Cross's escape routes were being systematically closed off. Cross's horse stumbled on the rocky trail, giving Dawn and Shadow the chance to close the distance between them. The trader's face was wild with desperation as he realized that the child he had tried to intimidate was now his pursuer, backed by the full power of the federal government. "You think you've won, you little savage?" Cross screamed, wheeling his horse around to face Dawn and Shadow in a small clearing where the trail split three ways. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." Dawn slipped from Shadow's back, the braided rope still in her hands, her war paint making her look older and more formidable than her 8 years. The eagle feather in her hair seemed to glow in the dying light, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had looked death in the face and chosen to fight. "I unleashed the truth," she said simply, "and the truth is that you're a coward who hurts innocent creatures because you can." Cross raised his rifle again, but this time Shadow was ready. The donkey charged forward with the courage of an animal defending its chosen family, his powerful body slamming into Cross's horse and sending the trader tumbling to the ground. The rifle flew from Cross's hands as he hit the rocky soil, and Dawn was there in an instant, kicking the weapon out of his reach. For a moment, the corrupt, trader and the painted child faced each other in the gathering dusk, power confronting innocence, cruelty meeting compassion. "You ruined everything," Cross gasped, struggling to his feet with blood running from a cut on his forehead. "Do you understand what you've done? Years of work, contracts worth thousands of dollars, relationships with people who could have made me rich, all destroyed by a stubborn brat and her pet." "Shadow isn't my pet," Dawn replied, the braided rope coiled in her hands like a symbol of the trust that had bound them together. "He's my friend, and friends protect each other." That was when Hayes and his men arrived, surrounding Cross with drawn weapons and the full ceremonial authority of federal law enforcement. The trader looked around at the circle of soldiers and marshals, his face collapsing as he realized that his criminal empire had finally crumbled. "Jeremiah Cross," Hayes announced formally. "By the authority vested in me by the United States government, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, animal cruelty, weapons smuggling, and threatening federal witnesses." Cross's shoulders sagged as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. All the bluster and intimidation that had made him feared throughout the territory was gone, leaving only a broken man who had gambled everything on cruelty and lost. "The evidence against you is overwhelming," Hayes continued, his voice professional, but tinged with satisfaction. "The healthy donkey you claimed was dead, the testimony of witnesses you tried to silence, the documents proving your fraudulent contracts. It's enough to put you in federal prison for the rest of your life." As Cross was led away by the marshals, Dawn felt a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. Justice had been served, but she took no pleasure in seeing any creature, even a cruel one, reduced to defeat and despair. Shadow nuzzled her shoulder with the gentle affection that had become their private language, and Dawn realized that her journey had come full circle. The dying animal she had found in the forest clearing had become the catalyst for exposing corruption that reached the highest levels of territorial government. "You did well, little sister," Standing Bear said, emerging from the forest with Luna close behind. The village elder's weathered face showed both pride and relief as he took in the scene of Cross's capture. "You chose compassion when the world demanded cruelty, and justice followed." Luna wrapped her daughter in a fierce embrace, her hands shaking slightly as she felt the solid reality of Dawn's safety. "You were so brave, Takoja, but never scare me like that again." Hayes approached them with something like wonder in his expression. "Miss Dawn, what you accomplished here today, saving Shadow, exposing Cross's crimes, helping to prevent attacks on innocent settlements, it's the kind of courage that changes history." Dawn looked up at the young officer, then at her family, then at Shadow, grazing peacefully nearby as if federal arrests were perfectly normal occurrences. The war paint on her face was beginning to smudge, but the eagle feather in her hair still caught the starlight that was beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I just wanted to help," she said simply. "Shadow was dying, and I couldn't walk away." But even as she spoke those words, Dawn understood that something fundamental had changed. The frightened child who had hidden her healing work in secret was gone. In her place stood a young woman who had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could expose the largest injustices, and that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about choosing to do what was right despite the fear. The leather-bound healing journal that Willa closed in the present-day forest clearing contained 47 years of wisdom, written in the careful script of someone who had learned that knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied. Every remedy Shadow had taught her through his recovery, every lesson about courage and compassion that their friendship had revealed, every insight about the connection between healing bodies and healing communities, all of it was preserved in those pages, waiting to be passed on to the next generation. Ben sat beside his grandmother on the same fallen log where their story had begun. But he was no longer the restless city boy who had complained about walking through the forest. The tale of Dawn and Shadow had worked its way into his heart, changing something fundamental about how he saw himself and his place in the world. "What happened to Shadow?" Ben asked, his voice soft with the reverence that comes from hearing. "A story that matters." Willa smiled, her weathered hands tracing the smooth cover of her journal. "Shadow lived for 23 more years, becoming the most beloved animal in our village. He helped carry supplies for Luna's healing work, played with children, and seemed to understand that his life had been saved for a purpose larger than just survival." She gestured toward a grassy area near the creek where wildflowers grew in a pattern that looked almost intentional. "He's buried there, under those Indian paintbrush flowers. Every spring they bloom brighter and more beautiful, as if his spirit is still nurturing the earth." Ben looked at the flower patch with new eyes, understanding that this whole forest was layered with stories and memories that connected past to present. "And Dawn? What happened to her?" "Dawn became the most respected healer in the territory," Willa replied, opening her journal to a page filled with pressed flowers and careful notes. "The courage she showed in standing up to Cross became legendary, and people traveled hundreds of miles to seek her treatment. But more importantly, her friendship with Shadow taught her that healing was about more than just medicine. It was about seeing the dignity in every living creature." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees, casting the same golden light that had illuminated the climactic confrontation between a painted child and a corrupt trader so many decades earlier. In that light, it was easy to imagine Shadow grazing peacefully while Dawn practiced the healing songs that would make her famous throughout the Old West. "Lieutenant Hayes became a lifelong friend and advocate for our people," Willa continued, turning the pages of her journal to show Ben newspaper clippings and official letters. "Cross's trial exposed a network of corruption that reached all the way to Washington, and Hayes was promoted for his role in bringing the criminals to justice. He visited our village every year until he died, and he always brought carrots for Shadow." Ben studied the faded photographs and documents that told the story of how one act of childhood compassion had rippled outward through time. "It's hard to believe that saving one donkey could change so much." Willa closed the journal and looked directly into her grandson's eyes with the penetrating gaze that had made her own reputation as a healer and wise woman. "That's the lesson, little wolf. We never know which of our actions will echo through history." Dawn thought she was just helping a suffering animal. She had no idea that her kindness would expose corruption, prevent attacks on innocent settlements, and inspire a generation of people to choose courage over convenience. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden donkey that had started this whole story. The toy carved by Dawn's father, carried through decades of triumph and sorrow, worn smooth by countless moments of nervous energy and quiet reflection. "This belongs to you now," Willa said, placing the small carving in Ben's hands. "Not because you're the oldest grandson, and not because it's valuable. You get it because you understand what it represents." Ben held the toy reverently, feeling its weight both physical and spiritual. The simple wooden donkey seemed to pulse, with its own life, connecting him to his great-great-grandmother and all the choices that had led to this moment. "What am I supposed to do with it?" he asked. "Whatever feels right," Willa replied. "Dawn carried it when she needed courage. I carried it when I needed to remember that healing sometimes requires standing in dangerous places. You'll carry it when you need to remember that compassion is not weakness. It's the strongest force in the world." As they prepared to leave the forest clearing, Ben spotted something that made his heart skip, a young bird that had fallen from its nest, lying motionless near the creek. His first instinct was to walk past, to assume it was already dead, and that interfering would be pointless. But the wooden donkey in his pocket seemed to warm at his touch, and Dawn's story echoed in his mind. Without saying a word, Ben knelt beside the injured bird and carefully examined it for signs of life. "It's breathing," he said, looking up at his grandmother with excitement and determination. "Barely, but it's alive. Can we help it?" Willa smiled as she watched her grandson make the same choice that had defined their family for generations, the choice to see suffering and respond with compassion rather than indifference. "We can try," she said, opening her healing journal, to a page about treating injured wildlife. "But you understand that we might fail, that sometimes, despite our best efforts, we can't save everyone?" Ben nodded seriously, cradling the bird in his gentle hands. "I understand, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." As they walked back through the forest toward home, 3 generations connected by the simple truth that kindness multiplied through time. Willa knew that the lesson of dawn and shadow would continue. Her grandson would tell this story to his own children someday, and they would tell it to theirs, and the ripples of compassion that began with one 8-year-old girl and one dying donkey would spread through the generations like light chasing. Away darkness. The wounded bird in Ben's hands stirred slightly, and Willa allowed herself to hope that this would be another story with a happy ending.